there were several influences in my life that led me to be interested in math. And so as an undergraduate major in college, I decided to be a math major. And when I got to college, I was doing that, and I was doing fine, but it wasn't that much fun compared to what I saw my friends doing, and that was that they were mainly psychology majors. And that sounded a lot more fun to me. So I decided to do a double major in math and psychology. And so I did that. And then the only course I had that really overlapped the two was statistics. I really had no idea what statistics was at the time, but it seemed like the one thing I could do that would overlap my two interests. So I decided to go get a Ph.D. in statistics, which I did, and not realizing that the psychology part of it was just sort of a small little corner that wasn't really what I would be expected to do in graduate school. But anyway, that's how I got there.
And in your math classes, were you one of the few women in that time period in math?
I was one of the few women in math in the time period, yeah. And in statistics, when I went to Penn State for my graduate degrees, and when I started, there were a fair number of women in the Ph.D. program with me, in the graduate program with me. I didn't know if they were master's or Ph.D. students because we really didn't distinguish immediately. But at one point, I looked around in one of my classes and I realized I was the only woman left. And so I was the only one that went on to get a Ph.D., as it turned out. And in fact, I didn't realize at the time, but I was the first woman to get a Ph.D. in that department. So I don't think I realized at the time quite how unusual it was for a woman to be getting a Ph.D. in a STEM-related field, a technology-type field.
Right. Well, so it doesn't sound like you felt isolated or that you were treated differently. Sounds like you were kind of oblivious.
Oblivious is a good word for it. But if I was treated differently, I feel like I actually had some advantages because I was unique. So, it's like I wasn't just lost in the crowd. So my professors basically knew who I was, and, I got along with everybody. And so it just, it seemed to me, if anything, it helped me at that stage in my career. Now, I'm sure there were plenty of times when it didn't, but at that point during graduate school, I felt like I was accepted and it was a good fit.
And then in some ways you become like the I don't know what the right word, the pet or the little star, or we're so proud of her because she's our token woman.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If I hadn't done well, they might not have felt that way.
Yeah. Right. And do you see a big change now in undergrad math statistics in terms of gender balance in students?
Did I just disappear?
No.
Yes, I definitely do. I think, especially in statistics, unlike some other fields, I think the undergraduates are more than 50% women.
How interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Is that nationwide or is that UCI?
No, that's nationwide. Yeah, statistics that we have on statistics show there are over 50% of the undergraduates are women, but that includes biostatistics. And I think even for master's and PhD programs, it's approaching 50%. But biostatistics tends to be an area that attracts more women because it's health related and it's something where people feel like they can make a difference. And for some reason, women seem to be more drawn to that idea and also to the idea of working in teams, working with other people collaboratively.
What do you think has made the difference in the influx of women into STEM fields?
Well, I think there are still fields where they're not doing so well, like computer science.
Engineering.
Engineering and so on. Yeah, I think critical mass makes a big difference. I think, as oblivious as I was, not most women are not oblivious to who else is around them. And so I think the fact that there are plenty of other women and more women faculty members now maybe seeing that they can see as role models.
Mm-hmm. And aren't there organizations that are geared towards getting girls interested in STEM topics even in elementary school?
Yes, there are definitely programs that are helping with that, getting girls interested in STEM. In statistics, I think one thing that's happened is advanced placement statistics, which is the high school program that students take a year-long course in statistics, and then they get, if they take the exam at the end of the year, if they do well, they get college credit for the course. And there are 30-some advanced placement courses overall, But the ones that are in STEM fields, I think of those, statistics has a good reputation as being something that's a little bit more hands-on and, yeah, exactly, applied. So I think that draws a lot of girls to take statistics in high school. And then once they realize what it is and that it's an option, I think that helps with majors. We've seen an incredible increase in the number of statistics majors at the undergraduate level in the last maybe 10 years, and I think that's quite a bit due to advanced placement statistics, so that people come into college aware of that as a profession.
It's interesting that the activist Parkland, Florida students who were in the gun control movement, a lot of them came out of AP classes, and a lot of what they knew and how they approached making change was from AP classes.
Huh. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. I was involved in the AP statistics program for a very long time, including leading the grading of it for the last 5 years. So I'm a little bit passionate about it and maybe a little biased, but I think it's a really great program, at least in statistics. I don't know about the other areas.
But it's interesting that now women are the majority of undergrads and graduate students. So there's some kind of shift has occurred. That's
right. Yeah. And again, I think critical mass is really important. Yeah.
And some people are bemoaning, oh, boys, young men are disadvantaged. The women know how to sit still and be disciplined. I don't know. Any explanations why there aren't more men?
Well, I think, we see more men now because it's an interesting shift in statistics toward data science. So statistics has gone from being really mathematically based to being computer science based. And I think it's a really good shift for the profession. And I think it means we're now attracting men as well, because they tend to like the computer science part of it and not so much the applications part. But it's a great fit. So I think we're attracting both. And that's why I think statistics, one of the other reasons statistics has risen as a major in terms of numbers, is that at UC Irvine, we actually created the data science major instead of a statistics major at the undergraduate level. And so they take a combination of statistics and computer science courses. And that may actually be really beneficial in terms of getting more women involved in computer science as well, because they're going in through that aspect of it.
What was there about the family that you grew up in that was okay with their daughter being excellent in math? Did they encourage that, or did that just happen? Or
that's really interesting, because my parents were not mathematicians at all. My mother was a social worker. My father was a journalist. And that may be where I got my passion for promoting statistics to the public. But my mother was very supportive of me. And I think it was more the supportive of me in general to do well academically that had a big influence. It wasn't math per se. It was just, basically encouraging me to continue academically. I think I led the life she would have liked to lead if she had lived in a different time period. She tried 3 times to get a master's degree and finally got one the same time I got mine.
Oh.
The first 2 were thwarted by marriage and then a child. So I think she really, she was a strong encouragement to me and a great role model for me.
What's your birth order?
I'm second oldest of 5 children. Older sister, younger brother, and then 2 more girls after that.
Did they all gravitate towards high-achieving careers like yours?
Not all. Well, so one of them unfortunately committed suicide at one point, so she never quite got there. She was the youngest. My brother has his own business, so he gravitated toward a science kind of career and then created a business out of that. But my other 2 sisters became social workers, like my mother.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
How did you get involved in doing the analysis of remote viewing and paranormal ESP kind of experiments?
So when I got tenure at University of Davis, which is where I was for much of my career, I decided it was time to start branching out, start looking for things that I could do that were more interesting than what I had been doing, frankly. And so I did a sabbatical at Stanford University. And just coincidentally, I met Hal Puthoff and Ed May, who at that time were the ones that were still running the remote viewing program for the government at SRI. And they needed statistical help. So I started by working as a consultant for them and got really drawn into it because there were no other statisticians doing it. It's easy to be the world expert when you're the only one doing something. So So I did that, and then I started attending their conferences. Because I had a year sabbatical, I could go to conferences, and some met other people in parapsychology at the conferences, and one thing led to another. Eventually, a few years later, I ended up taking a year leave of absence from Davis and working at SRI as a visiting scientist, and that kind of clinched it because I got to see hands-on, day-to-day, what was going on.
And what you write about in some of your articles is that there's not a huge difference in the ESP experiments. Like chance would be 24% hit rate, but then the average is 27. So I was surprised that the rate was so low. And I don't know if that's true for the remote viewing, because they seem to just be on target, on target, on target.
So that probably is for forced choice experiments, and 25%, they're usually set up so that there's a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right by chance, so 25%. For the remote viewing and other what's called Ganzfeld, which are other free response kinds of experiments, we see more like a 33% hit rate. So that's pretty convincing, and especially when you see it over and over and over again across laboratories and experiments and so on, across modalities, so remote viewing, and then something called Ganzfeld experiments, which are a little bit more complicated than remote viewing, but basically measure the same thing. So that's convincing, but also those statistics don't really capture what you're talking about, which is some of the wow, gee whiz hits that we see. Because the experiments are set up to have very conservative statistics. They're set up so that if the remote viewing, let's talk about remote viewing, if the remote viewing is good enough so that somebody could pick out the right target from 4 dissimilar choices, that scores as a hit. But it just has to be good enough to distinguish it, distinguish the right target out of 4 choices that are chosen to be as dissimilar as possible. So if it's an exact match, it gets no more credit than one that's just good enough to pick one out of the 4. So the statistics are conservative in that respect. We've tried various other methods, so things like trying to list all the possible features that could be in a target and in a response and match them up. But nothing seems to work quite as well as just a human judge looking at it and seeing, is this a good, which picture or which target, whichever, it's like outbound or picture or whatever it happens to be, which one matches what the remote viewer drew the best. And, there's no sort of assessment of how well it matches after that.
I'm sure you tried to do it, remote viewing. Did you succeed?
Depends what you ask. I've only tried a few times. And never in a formal experiment. If you ask Russell Targ, he'll say I succeeded because he led me through one time at a restaurant, and he thinks I did a really great job. I'm a little bit more critical, and so I'm sure I was convinced, but and it wasn't a formal experiment. So
the procedure is to get into the remote viewing frame of mind. You quiet your mind, but how do you do that? What was their procedure for getting at least beginners into a frame of mind where they weren't with all the mind chatter?
Right. So it depends on the experiment. At SRI, we were mainly using the same people over and over again because it was a classified program, so we couldn't just bring in anybody. But in general, what's done is just a relaxation exercise to precede trying to do the remote viewing, or in the Ganzfeld experiment to try to precede doing that, just to kind of clear people's minds and get them to relax a little bit.
Could that be something as simple as your feet are relaxed and heavy, your ankles are warm and that?
Right, a body scan relaxation exercise. Yeah. I'm actually going to be doing one pretty soon for a group that asked me to come and talk about remote viewing, and it's going to be my first time to actually try doing it on my own. Try leading people through it on my own. So I'll see how well I do, but I'm probably going to take a tape player or something with a speaker to lead them through an exercise so that I don't have to actually just try to do it myself. I don't know. I will say, you asked me about me doing it. One thing that really convinced me as much as the statistics, well, I shouldn't say that. The statistics are what really convinced me that there's something there. But something that intrigued me early on was my father actually went and participated in some of the Ganzfeld experiments at lab in Princeton. And it was shortly before he passed away. But at that time, they were doing an experiment where they had people come 4 times to see if the same people could do a repeat good or bad performance. So my father went 4 times, and twice I was the sender. And in this particular experiment, there's a sender and then what they call a receiver. All 4 times he went, he got a first place match. But the 2 times that I was his sender, he not only got a first place, he did one of those things I talked about earlier where there's no question that he got it right. You know, you don't have to be a good human judge to pick out the right answers. So one of them, this is kind of a funny story. So the first time he went with somebody. I didn't live in the area. He lived in southern New Jersey. So he went with a friend of his. And the target material at that time that happened to get randomly chosen for him was a picture of the Kremlin. So apparently he described it. He was talking about, red and government and that sort of thing. So when he saw the 4 choices, because in the Gansfeld, the person who's doing the viewing actually is the judge as well. So at the end of the viewing, they show him 4 choices and say, which one do you think you were trying to describe? So when he saw the Kremlin, he said, that's it. So he got a first place match. So we're driving up to Princeton from southern New Jersey the first time that I went as his sender, and he's explaining this to me, how he did and so on. And so we get there, and I go into the sender's room, and there's 164 targets, but just coincidentally, up comes the Kremlin as the target. So my father's in this other room. I can hear him. Of course he can't hear me. That would be cheating. And he starts talking, and he starts saying, oh, I see red, and I see gold. And then he says, it's the Kremlin again. I know it shouldn't be, but it is. So he was right on.
And your job was to just focus your intention on the image?
Exactly, and try to send it to him in some whatever way. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then the second time I went as a sender for him, it was, in this time, sometimes they used video clips instead of a picture. And this time it was a short video clip of a spaceman in a white spacesuit floating against a blue background. That's all it was. So my father's in there, and he starts talking about the painting called The Blue Boy. And I don't know if you've ever seen that painting, but it's a boy, basically, and it's blue and white. It's a boy dressed in a white outfit with a blue background, I think, or maybe it's the opposite, a blue outfit with a white background. But anyway, that's basically what it is. So when he saw the 4 choices, as soon as he saw that one, he said, as soon as he saw the one of the guy floating in space in a white spacesuit against a blue background, he said, that's it, the Blue Boy. So again, a pretty good first place hit. And he went one other time without, with a different sender, and again, he got a first place hit. So around that time, I was sort of thinking, well, all this could be fraud, it could be cheating, because I had only seen remote viewings at SRI, and they used the same people over again, and I thought, oh, maybe they're in cahoots, they're just trying to convince the government there's something there. But I knew my own father wasn't cheating, so that was something that I think helped to draw me in a little bit, even though, of course, that's not nearly as convincing as hundreds and hundreds of studies that show statistical results.
Well, while you were at Princeton, were they doing the random number generator machines?
So this is a different lab. It was Charles Honorton was his name, and unfortunately passed away in the 90s, but he's the one that really started using the Gansfeld technique. And he had a lab in Princeton called Psychophysical Research Labs, not on the Princeton campus. So that research on the Princeton campus with the random number generator was going on at the same time.
Did you have a chance to bop over there or not?
I did go see that one time, but not on my own. There was a conference there, and they did a little tour of the lab for us.
But you didn't get a chance to sit in front of one and make it go coherent.
No, that's right. Yeah.
That would be fun. So what's interesting to me is that after 20 years, the kind of general conclusion was that Stargate hadn't produced anything useful, that there were too many cues given to the viewers, that people like Uri Geller did sleight of hand. Why do you think there was such dismissal of the results, even though they're so concrete with drawing the silo or the submarine or whatever it is they were viewing?
I think it's really important to separate out the 2 parts of the program. So there was the scientific program going on, and then there was what they called the operational remote viewing program, where they were basically trying to spy on our enemies. And the early part of that was some of this evidential stuff that you're talking about. What I reviewed for the government in 1995 when they declassified the whole thing was the scientific part of the program. And I did it along with a skeptic named Ray Hyman. And we actually did conclude that there was something going on statistically that could not be explained by chance. But Ray, being a skeptic, said, but it can't possibly be paranormal. There has to be a normal explanation. And I said, okay, give me one, and he couldn't. So our report basically concluded that there was something established scientifically, statistically, that was not explainable. But we were not allowed to look at any of the operational materials. And that was a bone of contention at the time. Ed May, who had directed the whole program, was really upset, with good reason, because apparently nobody looked at the operational stuff. So my guess is the CIA wanted to shut it down. It had been with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and they wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to give it to the CIA. The CIA had enough of their own problems at the time. The Cold War was over. The CIA didn't really want it, I think. So they commissioned this report. There were some influential senators in Congress who wanted this to continue. So they were the ones that pushed to have this report commissioned. But I think they set it up so that they could make whatever conclusion they wanted from the report. For the scientific part, by putting the skeptic and me on there, because they knew previously what both of us had said about the field, and then by simply ignoring the operational stuff to a large extent. And so they concluded that it wasn't worth continuing, or so they said. Who knows? Maybe it is continuing.
Yeah, probably. Well, let me understand. So the operational is like spying on the Russian military establishment, and then the other part is doing just experiments in the lab.
Exactly. Yes.
And what did those experiments focus on? Like I go to this location and then you draw where I am.
Right, except after a while they stopped doing those what are called outbound experiments and started just using targets that were either photographs or short clips from movies, because it didn't seem to matter if someone was actually out there. And so they started, it was a little easier to just use these experiments where you used photographs or movie clips. But they were the same general idea. You would have someone do this remote viewing, and you would choose a target set. Like in general, we would choose 4 or 5 targets that were as dissimilar as possible, as I explained earlier. Have the person do the remote viewing, and then a judge would look at the 5 possibilities, one of which had been randomly chosen to be the right answer, so that there was no human bias built into the choice of the answer, and then see if you could identify. And again, when there were 4 choices, about 1 in 3 times, the judge could identify which one it was. So again, not great, but not bad either, and especially since some of them were really, really close matches, close descriptions. There were other experiments we tried to do. For example, one of the hardest things was to actually locate something. Think about trying to locate a missing person, or something like in one case they were trying to locate a downed aircraft that had crashed somewhere
in Africa. Yeah,
you've probably heard that one.
From Russell, yeah.
Before the Soviets did, and President Carter was the president at the time, and he has publicly talked about this event and that we did locate it using remote viewers. So those were the kinds of things we were doing. But those are anecdotal, so there is no way to evaluate those compared to what should happen by chance.
Right.
So I keep saying, to have a good experiment, what you need are 2 things. One, you have to prevent cheating or other means of ordinary communication. And 2, you need to know what should happen just by chance, so you can compare what did happen to what you would expect to happen just by chance.
But the odds of having the location of a downed aircraft within a small area are really small. I mean, so just in terms of statistical probability, those kind of hits are not probable.
Right, but again, we don't know what information was available and what they knew. So that's why it's really hard to evaluate that in terms of comparing it to what should happen just by chance.
In Russell's book, he also says that they located Patty Hearst when she was kidnapped. Right,
yeah. That's an intriguing story. I didn't know that until I read Russell's account, but it's too bad the police didn't choose to follow up.
Oh, yeah, really. So I know you've thought about this. What in physics, quantum physics, non-locality would explain the difference between a 33% and a 25% odds of getting those right answers?
Well, I'm certainly no physicist, and I'm as puzzled as everybody is by quantum physics, but my thinking about it, just as a lay person in that regard, is that there is probably no predetermined future. There are probably potential futures, some of which are more likely than others. And in quantum mechanics, I think that's already true. We know with quantum stuff that there are various states that could be actualized, and some, they have different probabilities, and consciousness comes in and actualizes one of them. And so I think that, for example, precognition could never be 100% accurate, because I think what people are probably tapping into is the most probable future, not the one that's definitely going to happen. And so I think that could be partly what's going on here, that these experiments seem to work equally well if it's precognition, by the way. In other words, if the target has not even been chosen when the remote viewer is trying to describe it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but that to me creates kind of a cohesive explanation for what could be going on, because it could be that it's all precognition, that, eventually the person's going to be shown the right answer. So maybe they're peering into their own future to see the target that they're eventually going to be shown. So that's kind of a consistent thing. And if we figure there's no predetermined future, but just probable ones, then maybe some people are good at tuning into those probable futures.
Russell Targ talked about geometry, that eighth dimension geometry allows for a pathway into the present that allows information. What do you know about geometry?
Right. So I don't know a lot about that. There's something called string theory, which and other theories that talk about maybe we live in a 10-dimensional world or maybe an 8-dimensional world, and that we only see 3 dimensions plus time. And I could imagine that if that's true, and we are projected into a 3-dimensional world, that if somebody was somehow able to expand into that larger dimensional world, they might be able to see things that the rest of us can't normally see. And as an analogy, there's a wonderful, although sexist, book written in the 1920s called Flatland.
Oh, yeah.
I think is a really good analogy. It talks about how the people in Flatland live in a 2-dimensional world. And one guy at some point is able to escape into 3 dimensions, and he sees what's really going on, what we would see, right, as the 3-dimensional world. And he comes back and tries to explain it to people, and they lock him up as crazy. So it could be that something like that is going on here, that time and space are not as, cut and dried as we think they are, 3 dimensions plus time. Yeah. So there's some theories, that time is really simultaneous, and that if you could sort of pop up above the 3 dimensions plus time that we live in, you could actually see that and see what's going to happen.
Maybe that's what mystics do.
Could be, yeah. I mean, that to me is one of the most fascinating things about this area is, I'm totally convinced statistically that there is something going on here, but we just don't know what it is. And I don't think we're going to convince anybody who's not already convinced until we come up with an explanation. And that explanation is going to have to come, I think, from physics or from some sort of multidisciplinary team working on the problem.
Well, non-locality explains it to me, but then Targ pointed out, but that doesn't work for precognition into the future.
Right. Well, non-locality would have to include time. In other words, you could have non-local time as well as non-local space. So, think about, suppose all time does exist at once, just like all space exists at once, right? So there's stuff going on right now in Australia, and I can't see it because I'm not there. So maybe there's also stuff going on right now in 2100, but I can't see it because I'm not there. So, it's possible that non-locality would include in time as well as space.
Ah, that's interesting. Have you heard of Robert Monroe?
Yes.
He in some of his books where he astral travels to the future. So
I didn't. Okay.
So that would kind of go along with what you're suggesting. So he goes into the future, and he also goes into another dimension where it's him, but in another body in another dimension, and he kind of enters into that body and does things that are inappropriate. So he realizes he should never do that again. But they had different physics. The locomotion system was different. So his experiences, which read like science fiction, but he says are true, would indicate that what you say, that time is accessible from all kinds of ways.
Right. Yeah.
How has this all impacted your own spiritual beliefs or your understanding of the meaning of life?
So first of all, I was lucky to not be raised in a religion that gave you shoulds. I was raised in the Unitarian Church, so I feel very fortunate about that, because the whole upbringing was that we should consider all different religious perspectives and ideas and make our own minds up about what we think is true. And for me, it's kind of an ongoing life experience to do that. So I still don't know what I really think is true, but I sort of lean toward this idea that there is an interconnectedness among everything, not kind of a supreme being, but an interconnectedness, and that we all play a part in that, and that you actually can change the world from your own living room by tapping into that interconnectedness and promoting the kinds of things that you would like to see in the world.
Is consciousness another name for interconnectedness?
I think universal consciousness would be the name. So I think we each have our own individual consciousness as well. I mean, you can almost think of it like an octopus with, 6 billion legs or whatever. So all interconnected at some level, but then also each having our own consciousness and individuality.
What are you researching, writing about now? I know you have a book about statistics that's geared for as a textbook.
Right. I've written 3 statistics textbooks, which are now in 4th and 5th edition, 2 of them. And my main goal there is to get people to understand statistics and in a way that's useful for their daily life. And the parapsychology stuff is really interesting there, because I think it's a really good example of belief versus data. And so I've done a lot of work with going around and giving talks to university audiences in particular, where I challenge people on this, because the data, if it were in any other area, it's so strong that there would be no question that there's really an effect there. And yet people's beliefs are also very strong. And so their beliefs kind of overwhelm the data in a lot of cases. There is a formal area of statistics called Bayesian Statistics that incorporates belief. And so I've been working on showing how to analyze parapsychology data using Bayesian methods, where you can see why people can agree to disagree, because if you have very, very strong beliefs that it's not possible, then basically no amount of data is going to convince you. But even the data that we have, the strength of the data we have, if your beliefs are strong enough against it, that amount of data won't convince you. So that's been a really interesting way to approach the topic, I think.
How do you spell Bayesian?
What? I said it's a very. I think it's a very productive way to approach the topic.
But how do you have a name for that kind of statistics?
Bayesian. It's B as in boy, Ayes. Bayes was the name of a guy in the 1700s who came up with a theorem that's used as the foundation for this area of statistics. So it's called Bayesian after him.
So it's kind of a sociological look at it. You can't statistically deal with the concept of people's beliefs, right?
Yes, you can, because you can quantify them. So you can ask people, the first question would be, what's your probability that let's just use the word psi, PSI, as a general term for paranormal abilities, okay? What's your probability that psi is possible at all? And, people might say 1 in 50 billion or something like that. So you can quantify that. And then you can also quantify by saying, okay, now let's suspend that for a minute and suppose it is possible. What magnitude of effect do you think would be possible? So for instance, if chance is 1 out of 4, what do you think it would be instead of that? And so you can quantify that as well. And you put all that together with the data, and you come up with what's called a posterior probability. So you have prior probability, and then mix it all in with the data and come up with what's called a posterior probability. And if people start with a small enough probability to begin with, then their posterior probability is still going to be pretty small. But if they start with a maybe 50-50 chance, then the data should convince them.
What do you find, like, as an aggregate or a meta-analysis of the people, the groups that you've talked with around the world, I guess? How do people tend to sway in terms of being skeptics or open?
I think I've noticed a change over the years, actually. I think people have gotten more open, or maybe they're just more willing to admit it. But I think they're not convinced by data. It's kind of ironic to me that statisticians in particular, who are mainly the audience I talk to, claim that data is the most important thing, and yet sometimes I'll ask them, which would be more convincing to you? Another, 50,000 trials showing these same kinds of results, or one overwhelming personal experience? And they'll say one overwhelming personal experience, which I understand, but it's still kind of funny to me that they, even as professional statisticians, don't pick the data choice.
Right.
I think that's part of human nature, but and unfortunately, it's what we're seeing in other areas as well, right? People ignore data that doesn't support their beliefs, and they exaggerate data that supports their beliefs.
Right. What other studies do you point people to where there's above probability results besides the remote viewing and the other work at SRI?
The Ganzfeld, Ganzveld, FELD, sorry, Ganzfeld.
I think of Ganzfeld studies as people in a room that prevents any electromagnetic waves, but this is something different.
No, it's what you're talking about, but the Ganzfeld is just the apparatus, and so the Ganzfeld studies that have been done in parapsychology put people into those rooms, and then they basically do a remote viewing from within those rooms. Only instead of drawing, they talk into a microphone, and it's recorded. So basically, it's like remote viewing, except that they're talking instead of drawing. And then they're shown, at the end, there's a target, a true target, and at the end they're shown 4 choices, and they have to pick which one they think it is they were trying to describe. So it is a lot like remote viewing. And when I did my report for the government in 1995, I combined the information or the data from those studies with the data from remote viewing studies because I thought they were similar enough that they were both trying to measure the same ability. And so that's why I kind of lumped them together as a category of free response experiments.
And those were done at Princeton?
Those were done in a lab at Princeton, but they were also being done in a number of other places. So there was the experiment going on at Edinburgh University in the UK, at Rhine in North Carolina, and a couple other places as well. Amsterdam, University of Amsterdam. And so I combined all those results in a meta-analysis when I did my report.
Are there other academics that you know that are studying the paranormal? We know Dean Radin, but he's not at a university anymore. What universities do you know that are studying this paranormal?
There's more going on in Britain because of the Arthur Koestler endowed a chair in parapsychology when he died, and it went to the University of Edinburgh, and that was quite a while ago now. And so they have spawned a number of PhDs who have now started programs at other universities throughout the UK. So that's where there's the most research going on. The one at University of Edinburgh is also still going on. And so that's by far the most sort of densely, concentration of programs. There isn't much in the U.S., unfortunately, because the U.S. skeptics, or I would even call them deniers, not skeptics, have been so successful in making it not legitimate as an area to study. I was really lucky because as a statistician, we study data. So I wasn't actually doing parapsychology experiments. I was analyzing them. And it's kind of like analyzing anything else, when you have data. So I was really lucky that way, I think, or maybe not lucky isn't the right word, but I escaped a lot of the criticism that I think I would have had if I had been doing my own experiments.
Have you spawned students who are interested in the topic?
Not PhD students, unfortunately, to go on and do this. In statistics, again, if you get a PhD in statistics, you really have to develop methodology. So it's areas of application aren't really as important. But I do think that I've spawned interest throughout the statistics community in the results and what's going on.
I wonder what they say about you behind your back.
I know, right? Well, I can't be too unpopular. I was president of our largest professional organization.
Yay! That's great. Where are you headed? Where's your future research taking you?
Well, I just retired in June, so I'm going to have the luxury of discovering that, I think. But I would definitely like to stay involved with parapsychology, and I don't know, I'll see what else. I have some other things that I'm working on. I've always been really active in statistics education, and especially statistical literacy, trying to educate the public, as I mentioned earlier. So I think I'll do more of that work as well.
Anything else that you would like readers and listeners to know about the the statistics of the paranormal studies?
Um, I guess just that there are legitimate ways to study this statistically. You don't just have to rely on anecdotes, and that those methods are probably conservative. But on the other hand, I think people also need to be a little critical of anecdotes. I have my own anecdotes that I could explain as chance, or I could think they were paranormal. I guess I've seen extreme on both sides. I've seen complete deniers, and I've seen people that are a little bit too easily fooled by things that could just be explained in other ways. So what I want people to know is there is a in-between ground, which is you can study this stuff statistically. You can design experiments to study it. My great hope and wish is that the stigma of doing so goes away so that we can figure out what's really going on here, because there is something going on, and we're only going to figure it out if people are free to study it. So.
Well, I'm sure you've planted the seed of at least people thinking about it. And
I hope so, yeah.
So, good for you. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate your help with this.